Hello and welcome to this Uni Taster OnDemand event today. My name is John Cheek. I'm here from UniTasterDays. It's my job to introduce the event and introduce our speaker. The subject we're going to be looking at today is social policy, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Emilie Whitaker from the University of Salford. Emilie is a lecturer in social policy and is going to provide a guide to why you might want to consider social policy, what to expect on it if you do study it, application tips and careers. And with that, I'll pass things over to Dr. Emilie Whitaker, joining us from the University of Salford.
Thank you, John. So I have a number of objectives for our short session today, but the key thing for me is to introduce what the study of social policy is, the way we teach, the things you're going to look at in terms of your topic areas, what we look for in terms of our applicants, and then obviously some of the really important stuff about employment. So what transferable skills might you get from this? Where might you want to go next? But I think a useful place to start, given that social policy isn't a standalone topic at A-level, is to think a little bit about what social policy is. So I suppose the short version is that social policy examines how societies respond to meet human need. The longer answer is that means that social policy is concerned with examining, exploring, critiquing social problems. So we're concerned with how governments, societies and other actors strive or fail to meet the needs of really our populations. So these are issues such as homelessness, poverty, inequality. Social policy is really about encouraging us all to think through both the causes and the consequences of social policy decisions. So what are the impacts of government decision making on, say, the housing crisis? Or how might we tackle the cost of living crisis that we're seeing at present? How might we rebuild local resilience post-pandemic? These are big issues, and social policy will introduce you to the study of those issues. And importantly, and something that I'm really passionate about, and I know most social policy colleagues are, about supporting students to develop solutions. So it's not just looking at what our current challenges are, it's also about what might we do next? How might we do things differently? So these are just some issues that have been really high on the agenda, I'd suggest, certainly over the past 6 months and certainly over the past 2 to 3 years. So we've got the Grenfell housing disaster, the challenges of the cost of living, which is all across the headlines at present. We have the ongoing challenges around homelessness and more generally a sense that wages aren't keeping up with the cost of living, challenges of private rent, the challenges as well that people are facing in social housing. And finally, something that's really rocketed up the agenda over the past decade, often associated with the introduction of something called austerity, is the rise of people needing food banks. So people who are living with food insecurity, often those who themselves are in work. So on a social policy programme, so a degree course, we would look at areas like housing and homelessness. We would look at things like welfare reform. Core to any social policy programme is the study of inequalities. How did we get here? How might we move on from those things? The key thing for any social policy programme is about how do we currently meet those needs and secure well-being for our communities and for individuals. And that can be achieved through a range of public, private and voluntary sector institutions. So we're not just talking about government. Although I think it's fair to say that certainly in your introductory sessions, probably your first year programme on a social policy degree looking at contemporary social challenges, we're going to introduce you to how government works, what the two houses do, how legislation comes to be. That's essential, of course, but a social policy programme is broader than just what the government does or doesn't do, and it's certainly much deeper than policy, just as you would say, find it written in terms of statute or policy guidance. And social policy is always a critical study, I think, whatever really the time at which you're looking at, because we're all concerned with how we can do things better, how we can lift people out of poverty, how we can narrow those inequalities, how we can challenge systemic disadvantage. These are things that I think are perennial challenges, but I would suggest that where we are today. So at the beginning, kind of the 2020s, welfare and other public institutions do face considerable challenges. Part of that is the long tail of various economic crises from 2008. We've got an aging population, which dramatically shifts things like tax and work. We have changing patterns of work, certainly wrought by the pandemic. We know that we're facing real challenges in terms of the environment, and our relationship to place is changing. And there's also some signs of some quite deep-rooted kind of changes in priorities across generations. So the kind of expectations that perhaps my grandparents, your grandparents had for what makes a good life, for us might be different. So alongside these profound economic, social and demographic challenges, and where they manifest, so like the kind of examples I've put on the screen in front of you, we do have the impacts of the pandemic. And taken together, there is a real sense that we're at a kind of a risk point, that we perhaps are reversing some of those longer standing social advancements in terms of health, well-being, wealth itself and security. So these are kind of fascinating times to be studying our contemporary social challenges, which is at heart what a social policy programme, what a social policy degree lives and breathes for. I think it's important to be upfront about the way in which social policy, because it's interested in understanding contemporary social challenges and how we meet them, is explicitly multidisciplinary. So you will be exposed to ideas and practices from history, from sociology, from politics, and from economics, because to understand any contemporary social problem really demands that we can see it from a number of different angles. And it's through that intersection that will help us, I think, to develop meaningful and relevant solutions for it. So I think we could take an example like, say, social security, so often what's referred to as benefits. Well, if we took a historical perspective on that, we could see that what we understood post-World War II to be the kind of great change, the great settlement between the state and the citizens around things like universal access to services, so things like the NHS, that everyone should have access to, it's free at the point of use. We would perhaps look at historical take on the place of benefits within that, creation of which was really geared to see off the worst kind of challenges that come from being unemployed suddenly, the insecure job market. If you fell ill, the sense of collectivism, the point of that early form of social security was the sense that everybody paid in, so if you ever fell on hard times, it was there for you. But if we look at how those systems have changed over time and say pay particular attention to the kind of benefit side of things that we'd call benefits today, that sense of universal there for everybody, because there was kind of an acceptance that sometimes fate happens and things happen to people. We now have an increasingly targeted system that's dependent on something that we call it's conditional. So there are certain activities now that say job seekers are expected to do in order to receive those social security payments. That's a profound shift from where we were when those ideas were first created after World War II. So history gives us that long sense of change. But we also might want to look at the politics of that. So one of the reasons perhaps in the shift from a universal model of support for people that fall on hard times to something that's more challenging and more targeted and demands certain behaviours and actions on behalf of those receiving those benefits is about politics. It's about thinking about social security, not perhaps as a universal support mechanism that's there for people when they fall on hard times, but perhaps something that's to be dissuaded, perhaps something that there is a sense of doubt that's cast upon the people that are requiring that. We could use sociology and sociological explorations to look at the impact of those changes. What is it like today to experience that kind of conditional and targeted form of welfare reform? What is the impact on your day-to-day life? What is the impact on your sense of security, your ability to maintain housing, to feed your family? And of course, that also relates to economics, because we're talking about tax and spend. We're talking about what money the Treasury gets in and how it chooses to spend it, which is an economic decision and a political one. So we can see that using ideas and approaches from lots of different interdisciplinary backgrounds provides us with that sense of holism to really tackle those challenges today. It gives us a number of angles on social problems, and it's through using that variety of angles that I think that we're much more likely to develop meaningful solutions to those challenges. I think, given that I hope I've been quite clear so far that social policy is broad, but it's deep, and it's about those contemporary challenges. This is absolutely a degree course for you if you're interested in what's really behind those headlines, about current affairs, about the politics of today, about how we got to where we are, about social movements. These are kind of the things that get me excited and my colleagues excited, and it's the things that I see in my classroom as well. And as such, there's actually quite a broad range, as you might imagine, of likely modules that you're going to study dependent on where you choose. So these are, I suppose, the core themes or topics that I would imagine almost all social policy programmes are going to introduce you to. So first of all, you're likely to study what we'd call the policy making process. So how does something like, say, food insecurity become framed as an issue? How does it become, or is it even challenged or looked at through legislation? How might that work? What is the place of government? What is the place of the House of Lords in that? So an introduction really to the policy making process is going to be a core part of any degree programme. It's also likely that you'd look at implementation and analysis. So key thing to remember is that social policy doesn't just happen as written. It's not just something that government ministers decide to do. It has to be actionable or indeed challenged on the front line. So what goes on in your classrooms, by your teachers, with families, with social workers, these are forms of policy implementation. So what happens on the ground? How might we analyse what happens on the ground? That's another, I'm sure, almost essential element of almost any social policy degree programme. Poverty and inequality is really the bread and butter of a social policy programme, particularly in your first year as you build up your confidence in exploring what the degree might look like. It's very much the kind of go-to place. Same with social security and welfare. How have those ideas about the welfare state changed? Where do we spend our money now? How are services and benefits framed? How are they perceived? Absolutely likely. Comparative and global policy. So I think it's fair to say that with social policy, it does tend to skew on quite a large number of degrees in the early stages as really around British or European social policy. But I would imagine, and certainly it's the case on our programme, that you will be introduced to global and comparative policy, the policy-making process through, say, global institutions like the UN, but also comparative. So how is it that we do things differently from Sweden or from France? What does that tell us about priorities? What does that tell us about decision-making? And as we know, the world is interconnected, it's global in terms of its flows of capital and indeed of ideas. That's often a really important way to think about how we can explore perhaps the same challenges, but with profoundly different tools. So it's something to look out for when you're having a look at degree options, the extent to which you're interested in pursuing perhaps global policy and the extent to which that particular programme is likely to make that available to you. We're really passionate about research methods. So for us, we are really keen, not only that our students are able to assess evidence about, say, the usefulness or experience of people on the receiving end of a certain kind of social policy intervention, we also want them to be able to do this kind of stuff themselves moving forward. So many of our graduates will find themselves in policy roles and research roles. So it's really, really important for us that they know how to do basic statistical analysis, the difference between a case study design that perhaps involves long-term immersion in a particular community versus a number of shorter snapshot interview-based studies. We want our students to be well equipped to explore social policy and the challenges that we experience themselves. as well as then using that insight to critique, compare and contrast the evidence that they feel confident to use. Finally, a kind of core element of most social policy programmes will be either a dissertation or a placement module. So dissertation is an extended piece of work, commonly in your third year. It might involve doing some primary research yourself, so going out and gathering your own evidence and providing an analysis, or it might be a more book-based, literature-based dissertation. Or, and something we're really proud of, and I know it's become increasingly popular with other institutions, is a placement module. Now, social policy is about understanding, but it's also about doing. And it's about understanding through what we might call the experiential, right? The front line. It's about getting up close and personal to organisations and institutions that are working on the front line of tackling homelessness, of ending violence against women, of improving the support chances and life chances for poorer kids, of supporting families. And so a placement is a really good way to get the inside track and experience on organisations that are doing that work. And importantly, a placement module is built into your degree programme. So it's not like an internship that we know like students can struggle to fit around paid work and other commitments. This is built into your degree programme. So it's assessed, becomes part of your degree itself, but also will get you into some really, really exciting and interesting institutions that are doing that lived experience of challenging social problems, improving life chances on the ground. For us on our programme, we've had students, huge variety of locations, with police probation services, with some brilliant charities, from those that are supporting families to those that are working with food banks, all of which is geared to that sense of bringing the research and the knowledge that you've got of how policy works, where it fails, to the lived experience. So that's definitely one to look out for. And I think it's a real benefit for those that think they might want a career perhaps in politics or policy or research, because it means that you're exposed to that along the way. I've also put that there's loads of optional modules. So what you find with social policy degrees is it depends who you've got in the room in terms of the staff. So you might have a particular team, a social policy teaching team that's really passionate and researching around, say, race and racial inequality. You might have those that have done a lot of work around immigration. We have a lot of experience and expertise around welfare and welfare reform, housing and homelessness, and our optional modules reflect the specific research backgrounds of our teams. So one piece of advice when it comes to shopping around social policy degrees is have a look at that. Have a look at the kinds of optional modules that are on offer to you and if they really appeal to you. So it's definitely a degree where there's a lot of wonderful variety, and most institutions should be pretty upfront with you about the kinds of optionals they're going to offer. So you can really build something that speaks to your interests, which is super, super important. How might you be taught? I don't think there's anything that's particularly different from many other social science or humanities programs in terms of social policy teaching. The main way you're likely to be taught is through lectures and seminars. So lectures tend to be, there's more of you in a room, there's one of us up to the front, with forms of interaction, but a kind of a larger scale form of engagement. Seminars are much smaller, discussion-based stuff. So we might set you a task in advance to research a particular social problem or area, and then together we might come up with some ideas around solutions, or we might look at what an economic or a political take on a particular social issue might look like, and what kinds of solutions might that generate. We might ask you to look at an existing piece of research and then come to us, and collectively we'll explore the pros and cons of that piece, where we might use those kind of findings. So lectures, that those big kind of lecture hall delivery forms of learning, but we also would encourage a lot of seminars where you can really get to know your peers. There's a lot of kind of peer-to-peer learning, and it's much more, I suppose, interactive. Student-led sessions, so you might be tasked with working by yourself or in a group over a module on a particular project. where you use that time in class to really work on that and get expert advice. There are also placement opportunities that I kind of just briefly alluded to, that I would really encourage you to have a look when you're looking at degree programmes. Do they offer a placement opportunity? Where have previous students been? That is also a really particularly important space for things like presentation skills, working with others, working in a professional environment. On our placement option, we also make sure that you're writing actually in a way that's really conducive to your future potential employment. So we encourage things like briefings, case notes, case studies. So not just standard essays, but we're actually thinking carefully about the forms of writing that we can support you with whilst you're with us on a degree programme that we know you can take to an employer. So placements are particularly good for that. In terms of giving you that exposure. I've also suggested, and this is why it really matters, like don't be afraid to get in contact with the admissions tutors for a particular programme you're looking at, because that's where you can suss out these kind of things. So bonus things to look out for in terms of your teaching and learning. Do these programmes offer a mentoring programme? We do at Salford, we're really proud of it. It means that particularly our second year students can be paired up with an industry mentor. That could be someone from the Mayor office, bearing in mind that we cover kind of Greater Manchester, so that's Manchester and Salford. It could be someone from one of the councils. It could be, we've had detective chief inspectors at mentors for our students. It's about having somebody informally, I suppose, who can support you to understand the world in which they're working and perhaps can identify opportunities for you, who can support you in terms of developing those soft skills as well as the kind of formal written work, but the soft skills of communication, empathy, engagement with others that you haven't met. So do these programs offer mentoring? It's a really great informal way of learning and it opens up opportunities to you. And personal tutorship. So this should be quite common now in terms of other universities' offerings, but this is where you'll also be in a small peer group, maybe about 10 to 12 others, and you meet with your personal tutor. And that's about study skills, right? So your personal tutor might roll out a program with you around really basic but important things like how to reference, how to write decent essays, how to present yourself for perhaps like job interview work. So personal tutorship, these are all forms of learning, all really important, I think, developmental skills and experiences. It's worth looking out for in terms of those potential programs. Who is social policy for? Okay, so I think, and I think my colleagues in the broader social policy world encounter students in our classrooms who are passionate, who want to challenge the status quo and make change happen. They might be passionate about improving the life chances of families in need. They might be passionate about challenging racial injustice. They might well be passionate about work and changing natures of work and how can we embrace things like universal basic income. We just see that passion, and that often is about challenging forms of social injustice, and it's about bringing that fire and channeling it, I think, through the programme. So I would say that studying social policy is ideal for those of you that get really annoyed and shout at the telly about things, those of you that like debate, those of you that are about, that engage with social media and the news cycle, those of you that are really passionate. It could be that you might have already done work in your local community to improve things where you are. Great. Those I would suggest that I see a lot of them in the classroom. So I think studying social policy is ideal for those people in particular who want to really understand how power works, who want to understand how change can happen, who might themselves have an idea that they want to be involved in that process further down the line. And that's because social policy is about more than just kind of understanding and describing how we are and how we got here, but it's about seeking to change that for the better through practical action. In terms of potential backgrounds, So as I've suggested to you, social policy is explicitly multidisciplinary. So if you're coming with a background in history, economics, sociology, psychology, brilliant, fabulous, great. I think you'd be in a really strong position for a social policy programme. Those of you that are really talented perhaps around experience in terms of writing, creative writing, might want to challenge that. So those with English literature backgrounds, English language backgrounds, brilliant also. Also, students that have come through alternative or different routes, so BTEC routes, we see lots of those as well do really well in terms of social policy, because a lot of those students have practical experience of working on the front lines of organisations and supporting other people. So I'd say it's quite a broad swathe, but I think that passion, that interest in the social and the political, and of course things that you can demonstrate, which means you're good with words, you're good with making arguments, those kind of subjects. But we're very open, I think, in terms of our degree programmes as to what your background is. It really is about that passion, commitment and interest in social change and social injustice that marks out, I think, a large number of our students. And what might you get out of it? Before I get to the explicit employment element, I think it's worthwhile thinking about what a programme of this type, the focus and the ways in which we teach, might help you to develop those kind of skills that we would call transferable, so which aren't dependent on a single particular sector or a single vocation. So first of all, a social policy programme is going to give you research experience and knowledge. So you're going to be able to identify and differentiate between strong, well-evidenced research studies and those perhaps less so. You're likely to have been exposed to and indeed undertaken research of your own. This is brilliant. Loads and loads of employers are looking for people that can do forms of research, whether that's a pretty shallow and quick form of a survey, perhaps looking at how service users have experienced a particular policy change, or whether that's a long-term engagement, perhaps with a particular community, exploring change over time. This is invaluable, okay? So research experience, knowing about how to design a research study, having some kind of experience of doing your own, and importantly, of course, being able to then analyse and critique existing research. So important for so many organisations. Government, third sector, charitable sector, all are going to be really interested in you with that experience. Social policy degrees, because we teach in groups, small groups, large groups, we'll set individual, collective pieces of coursework. You're constantly showing that you can work independently, manage your own time, set your own parameters and deliver on them, but also that you can work in groups. Really, really important for, I think, any employer, that you've got people that are sociable and that can communicate verbally and get on with others, even in particular with social policy, with very, very diverse and different biographies and backgrounds. You're going to have a high level of written and verbal skill, because social policy degrees push and test and seek to improve and support you with that all the time. Because we're about solutions and ideas, you're going to be able to demonstrate that you can think creatively. Lots and lots and lots of employers are looking for people to put solutions on the table, to make suggestions, and then to use the evidence and research that you would have gathered to really underscore that. So it's also about building persuasive arguments with that evidence. Presentation skills, absolutely, both with your peers, with us as members of staff, and potentially if you engaged in things like mentoring or placement opportunities, with future employers, with people that use services, with citizens in general and communities. So collectively, what you're really going to show an employer, that you're passionate and creative people who understand how politics works, how power works, and you're about solution and resolution building. So this is a considerable volume, I would suggest, of transferable skills. And because there is a real diversity of social policy programmes out there, it may well be that you've chosen your optional modules with potentially a certain sector in mind. That could be maybe children and families. It could be an advocacy route. It could be around housing and homelessness. It could be around the environment and environmental justice. So the combination, I think, of being able to lead on things like a dissertation and placement, pick and choose some of those modules, plus those transferable skills, make you a real asset to a large number of employers. So where do we see our students and other social policy students end up? So probably no surprises, but central and local government, because they understand how policy works, how it develops, the place of formal political processes in that, legislation. So central and local government, of course, these are strong places for a lot of social policy graduates to go. Also in voluntary and third sector organisations, because voluntary and third sector organisations seek to challenge government and policy making. They seek to lobby on behalf of the people that they support. So that central understanding is really important for those, let's say, that are outside of those formal government processes as much as for those on the inside. We often see social policy grads go into research and policy making roles. So, I mean, relatively self-explanatory. So researchers for any of those organisations, perhaps working with communities, groups to understand the particular challenges that they face. Policy-making roles might be briefing, so exploring where current government thinking is and then advising particular clients that they're working for. We also see practitioner trajectories. So for those grads that perhaps had or developed a clearer sense of the people that they wanted to support and the kinds of quite maybe vocational work they wanted to do to enact their form of change, I suppose, we see that. So some social policy graduates will go into social work, some will go into criminal justice, housing, education. That, I think that power and that passion and that persuasive capacity means that quite a lot will end up in advocacy work as well. So that could be urban renewal work, challenging poverty, and trying to improve social inclusion. So maybe some of the charities that work around migration. And we've had some recent grads as well that are particularly interested in that urban renewal, that sense of how do we make cities accessible and open for all. Because of the variety of transferable skills and particularly that understanding of the policy-making process, we do also see graduates that go into project management, could actually be in the kind of commercial private sectors, into HR and management roles. And finally, public affairs, which I suppose is code for lobbying, really, because you can have a public affairs specialist working for a voluntary sector group or for a commercial sector organisation. Public affairs is really about seeking to influence policy. So you could be working, and with that knowledge that you have of key individuals, key aspects of the parliamentary process, where the kind of political landscape is, you might find yourself working in a kind of public affair or lobbying role. So I think there's quite a range, there's quite a lot of opportunities here for social policy graduates. And just to illustrate those, I just wanted to introduce you to two of ours. The recent graduates in the past 4 years, we've got Megan and we've got Matthew. And it's really to show how social policy courses can equip you to work on the front line and pursue change in particular and improvement, but from quite diverse perspectives. So Matthew has pursued a career in politics. So he worked for an MP as a researcher. He's then kind of progressed through the ranks, as it were, and he now works for some senior members on the Labour front bench as a researcher and as a special advisor. So he has taken that political knowledge, in particular that research experience, honed it, put himself out there, gained that constituency experience. So some of his early roles would have been responding to constituency questions, supporting that MP in their local area, engaging with the local press. As he's built up his portfolio of experience and taking those transferable skills, he's now working with the kind of the agenda setting bits of the Labour Party. So that's where he chose to kind of package up those skills and pursue it. Megan was always really, really passionate about children and families. She wanted to go out and make meaningful improvements in the lives of people in her local communities who were struggling. And she took that route by engaging in through postgraduate study, through and into social work. So Megan has been a fully qualified social worker. She's now looking to take on advanced study to pursue that still further with additional qualifications in things like counselling. So her ambition that she's fulfilled is very much about hands-on work, that practical, supportive work, and that ability to negotiate and understand complex systems of welfare, and particularly local authorities, to navigate and advocate for the families that she works with. So I think it's really just important to state that passion and that concern with social challenges and social problems can materialise in different ways and can be pursued in a number of different ways. These were just some final tips that I had for you that you might be thinking about doing a social policy degree as your next step on your learning journey. And I suppose they're on a theme really, which is don't be afraid to ask. So because of the diversity of programmes on offer, if you're looking at a particular institution, ask about specific strengths and specialisms. If you're interested in moving towards perhaps global environmental work, ask about what their offer is. If you're interested in perhaps urban renewal and advocacy work, ask about that. If you've done work potentially with LGBTQ plus organisations, what is the teaching around gender and sexuality like? Just ask. Okay, social policy programmes are pretty good in terms of the diversity of those optional modules. You really can build a kind of sense of interest and a bit of a, I suppose, mini portfolio. Ask about application process. Lived experience is valued. Don't hide it. This could be around work or formal work experience you've done. It could be around voluntary experience. It could be around maybe writing for a student newspaper, having your own blog. I think one of the most powerful personal statements I ever read was by an A-level student who was part of her sociology module, and her love of photography had done a long-term, I suppose, photographic portfolio around the changing nature of her neighbourhood, which was around what we'd call gentrification. So the ways in which, as housing gets more expensive, some of the local people, the established communities, find it hard to stay. And she'd kind of done this amazing portfolio of photography over that period of time. And then in her application, she wrote about that. And she wrote about the concerns that she had for a community, but the ways in which photography had actually opened a conversation within those communities about including working with developers and planners about how perhaps they could create something that was more open and accessible. So lived experience is valued. Tell us about the things that you've done that you're passionate about. And don't feel that only has to be paid at all. It's really about just telling us about those interests and what you've learned as a person, as much as any kind of formal sense of learning. It's really, really important. And as I'm sure the next point I'm making is, share your passion in the application. Don't feel that you don't need to hide that. That's something that I think really stands out to a lot of tutors, is that passion, whatever it is, tells us a bit about you, and that really helps to kind of humanise the whole application process. Do suss out any what I've called their real world opportunities on the potential programme. Things like placements that are built into the offer, because we know it can be challenging for students to find time and energy and focus to effectively work for free in terms of internships. Placements build them into the programme offer. I think that's important. And like we offer, look for things like mentoring. Are there schemes where you can shadow or be mentored by someone in a particular organisation or industry that you might be interested in? And another important thing is ask about what graduates are doing now. The reason that I wanted to just tell you a little bit about Megan and Matthew from our programme at Salford was to give you a sense of the variety of options that are open to you, but also to be honest about that. So don't be afraid in asking those institutions and those departments, what are they doing? Have you got any examples? What can you tell me about that? That will often give you a really good feel as for how the programme itself works and the kind of focus that it has. Otherwise, just to say good luck with your social policy journeys and exploring your options, and all the best.